Hi, I'm Ben. Welcome to my book corner. Today we're talking about another one of the new releases that I picked up during March. This time we're talking about The Revenant Games by Margie Fuston. This comes in at 416 pages long and was released on March the 19th. And this is a YA fantasy novel with just a smidgen of romance in there. As always, we will talk about the story, the characters, the world building, and the presentation before I give my final thoughts at the end. So let's just jump straight in. The story conceit for this is actually relatively simple. We are following Bly, a 17-year-old human female, who enters something called the Revenant Games. Bly lives in an area called the Gap, which is a period of pretty much scrubland between the two more powerful kingdoms of the witches and the vampires. And the witches and the vampires have an uneasy truce, with humans very much playing piggy in the middle. However, this truce is suspended once a year for 2 weeks for the Revenant Games to take place, the idea of which is for people to kidnap a witch or a vampire and deliver it to the other side. This is often sponsored by witches or vampires, and the winners of the prizes from each side are the ones that catch the most powerful vampire or witch. And the reason Bly has entered this is because she feels guilt for the death of her sister right at the start of the book. This isn't a spoiler, it's on the preface at the back. She also enters with her friend Emerson, who she has feelings for, who requires the vampire prize as well, for reasons that are gone into within the book. And you have this 40% of the book set up as it gets the world going and establishes a number of key players, before you then get into the meat grinding of this as they try and capture a vampire and a witch and play both sides so that they can get both prizes, something that is frowned upon. This is not a particularly unusual setup, although the idea of it being vampires and witches in opposition rather than normal governments is an interesting sort of flip on the script, although again, not something you haven't seen before, but it is a well-trod trope that works well here. So this is very much Bly's narrated story. Bly is a 17-year-old human girl who comes from the Gap, which I will touch on in world building. And due to stuff that happens in the first chapter, which is spoiled on the synopsis on the back of the book, she's blaming herself for the death of her sister Elise when they were out gathering mushrooms from quite close to where the witches are sort of based. And because of this, Bly has a deep-rooted hatred for the witches. The irony of this is the only way to fetch her sister back is to win the witch's prize. On the flip side of the coin, you then have Emerson. So Emerson is the best friend for years. Bly has feelings for them and was very close to Bly as well as Bly's sister Elise. The interesting thing about Emerson is that he also lost a sibling, in his case, to the vampires. So you have this interesting opposite push in terms of sympathies, for want of a better term. They both recognise that neither side is good, but Bly has a far deeper hatred for the witches, something that is enhanced quite early on in the story, and Emerson has an understandable hatred for the vampires far more than the witches. Again, there is stuff in the book that shows just how deeply and how far back some of that goes. And there are a number of other side characters as well that are relatively minor, but do have sensible motivations. The other two main ones, I'm not going to name them because it does spoil the story, is there's a primary vampire and a primary witch. And they are both reasonably well fleshed out, the vampire in particular, with the witch having some links to Emerson's backstory previously as well, which is explored. And the vampire is perhaps the most interesting because vampires are very much the apex predator. But this is a vampire that's bored and depressed and no longer wishes to still be alive and is willing to basically go along with this to help Bly out. And it's not 100% clear exactly why. And the motivations do change throughout the course of the story, which really does help. And out of all the characters, the vampire is probably the most likeable. Bly, whilst she makes complete sense, the way that she is and the way that she acts and the choices that she makes, is not what you would call a likeable character. She's very much a pointless dreamer, dreaming of stuff she can't have, and that puts her family in a difficult position, and was ultimately what led to the mistake that killed her sister. She's also very much the not favoured child as well, with Elise being the favourite of the family, with Bly not really having the necessary skill set to really contribute. So you do have this sense of rejection for her, and the whole reason for going for the foraging was to sell the mushrooms, to buy a dress, so Emerson would see her as something more than a friend. There are some interesting twists and turns in terms of the characters here. It does take a little bit of time to get going in terms of the development, and Bly obviously has the most, although there's a fair bit for both Emerson, the vampire, the witch, and also Elise as well, which is solidly done overall. The world building, however, is very, very interesting. It takes quite a bit of time to build up the world so we don't feel totally lost, with things like the creation myth, the way magic works, the fact that all magic works through blood, and it can be traced back, at least in theory, to a myth about a magical pool. And blood is very much the currency of everything. Vampires need blood to feed, to fuel their more supernatural abilities, their enhanced strength and speed and senses. Witches, on the other hand, can create magic and infuse items with magic for a period of time, so spells can be cast from items, but again, that requires blood. And the humans, well, they're basically a cattle farm in the middle, with their blood having enough magic to sustain spells and vampires alike. Although, interestingly, their blood is less valuable than the blood of either a witch or a vampire. But there's also some other interesting things going on here. You have the political situation where you have these three, the reason for the Revenant Games basically being there to, first of all, legally let the vampires and the witches kind of attack each other once a year, but also where humans sit in this, because humans have at one point managed to band together and push against and nearly break the chains off. And this is very much feels like a letting off steam situation to help keep the humans in their place. But also the dangers of the forest is well built in here as well. You have the idea of the various things that grow near the witches and different things grow near the vampires that have different values and are worth sometimes maybe the risk of going to collect them, but there is the risk there. For example, if you are caught gathering the berries near the vampires, there's every chance you'll be found drained of blood and dead. On the flip side, if you end up picking mushrooms, some of those mushrooms are going to be spelled with death curses or sleeping curses, so on and so forth. And the cost of magic is interestingly done as well. Everything here does have a clear cost. Not everything is overly well fleshed out, however, there is an area beyond the forest and beyond the vampire realm and beyond the witch's realm which is not especially well fleshed out. On top of that, you do have situations where it is clearly said that people are exiled beyond the woods, beyond the forest. So we don't really at this point know what's beyond there. But this does spend a long time, setting this up. So the world building is actually really, really interesting. And actually, in hindsight, is maybe the strongest part of this book in general, as it does build into the power base for the vampires and the witches as well as the political conflict that has been going on for centuries at this point. The humans do get a bit more of a short shift in many regards, but realistically, they're also the least interesting of the three major factions at this point. In terms of presentation, then, it's a pretty cover which you can see on screen. This does lack a map, which is a bit of a shame, because one thing that I didn't get a sense of throughout this was distance between the various kingdoms and where things sat. You don't really get a sense of how big anything is, which is a shame, because the Revenant Games take place over 2 weeks, so presumably there is a great deal of distance between them. But they managed to get in and out in a day in terms of foraging from their homes in the gap. So that's a little bit inconsistent. This is also written from the second-person perspective. So this is Bly's story being narrated about her, which is a little bit jarring at first. It's not a perspective you see written very often, and I needed to double-check that I was right on this, because it's something that you so rarely see. The other thing as well is the pacing on this fell off at the beginning. It takes about 40% of the way before it starts to really pick up. And I was actually under the impression that this was a standalone book, and while I've not seen anything confirmed, due to the ending and some bits I've seen in reviews, I suspect that this is going to be part of a series as well. So bearing that in mind, the pacing makes a lot more sense, as you've got to establish the world that this is taking part in. It's decently written, and once the pace does pick up, it manages to maintain a sense of tension and growing relationships throughout, and it does have a cast of engaging characters, even if none of them are especially likeable. Final thoughts then. Providing this becomes a series, this gets a higher grade from me on that assumption, because this does feel like a book one. The way it leaves off feels like the end of a book one, with a decent twist with a sting in the tail at the end, leaving the ending open for follow-up. This has done a good job of setting up an interesting and intriguing world, which appears to have a fair chunk of lore potentially dedicated to it, and you do have an interesting political style situation in terms of the vampires, humans, witches, interactions, and history. You also have some engaging, if not particularly likeable characters overall, but they are consistent and their actions do make sense for the characters that they are. So overall, I give this a 3.5 stars out of 5. I think a solid book one. If you're a fan of Hunger Games but want more vampires in it, you might find something to like here, and it's well worth a check out. So that's The Revenant Games by Margie Fuston. Are you looking at reading this book, or what are you reading at the moment? Let me know in the comments below. I will catch you all soon.